Welcome again to the Mike Rays podcast with that little special intro from the Shiva mantras that I listen to occasionally here on the podcast, but it comes from the Mahakatha, mantra meditation group, which produces a lot of mantras, particularly devoted to Ganesha, Shiva, Shakti related ones, Shakti deities, and Lakshmi. Haven't come across many Kali ones, but Sarasvati, definitely, for the goddess of wisdom and knowledge. And why am I talking about this? I'll be honest, didn't actually intend to have that mantra playing when I began this podcast, but it is themed in with what I'm wanting to talk about in this week's podcast, which has become a little less weekly than was regularly, but this is in alignment with the theme of tonight. And what I'm really getting at around mantras and doing things differently is encountering, integrating, and ultimately accepting the taboo as a means of moving beyond limiting beliefs and transforming reality. So the prior podcasts, I talked a lot about withdrawal of attention, the needs to change, tying into all this letting go theme and that archetype shifting, etc., of personal transformation, is more than trying to do things from the conceptual basis. We can bring forward positive practices like gratitude, etc. And there's this stage that we go through the spiritual awakening. We have the aha, the initiation phase, where we start to practice different conscious techniques, such as gratitude, such as speaking, talking, acting more consciously, having vision goals, or to-do lists that really move us forward in that direction of our conscious mind. And then we get to this point connected with the taboo, what could be called the integration of the shadow phase, the dark night of the soul, where we realize more than trying to do everything, trying to change all the pieces on the table with our hands, trying to excessively control, it's really important to work with what I would call the feminine frequency, the yin frequency of the yin and the yang, to encounter what is predominantly a lot of taboo in our culture, is the power of the feminine, the yin, the receptive mode, the birthing frequency. And what ultimately, I'm not going to say lies dormant in our subconscious, but what, from a taboo perspective, if me moving forward in the seat, if you're watching the visual version at the moment, it's to access the hidden feminine. It's to access it's only hidden because it's somewhat of the we're going deep in this one. Like the witchcraft trials of the Middle Ages and the 1600s, etc. This power of the feminine, of flow, of the yin, of the yielding, of surrender, of accessing and using our own intuitive inner power to manifest from beyond the conceptual need to force, fight, dominate, to ultimately let go. And so how do we let go if we are always trying to consistently control? Well, it's working with somewhat of the taboo, the unknown, which magic, sacred sexuality, even manifestation, the law of attraction, are somewhat in that bread basket, so to speak. And what I just began this episode with the Shiva music, I think there's something to do this with this episode that feels a little bit more off the cuff compared to the last couple, which have been in the car while driving, etc. Is it one of the most taboo? Yeah, I'm feeling even in accessing feminine wisdom from a masculine perspective, it seems like the opposite, isn't it? To access the feminine flow with yielding and creativity, sacred sexuality, connected with the body from a masculine, what I just played, then Shiva from a perspective of Cernunnos, the horned god, the master of animals, the Jesus Christ frequency, but not from a Christian perspective, the Jesus meaning I am, and Christ meaning truth. The sacred masculine from the Shiva perspective, which I'll see if I can bring up a Shiva picture for those who access this, the God that is connected to the earth and nature, who lives in the mountains, who is somewhat of an ascetic in terms of he's disconnected, detached from the world, but from his phase phase and face of the Vishnu aspect, who ultimately works within the world, who can create abundance and prosperity within the world. He's ultimately the faces. From a Hindu perspective, there's also Brahma, the creative creator, who's somewhat of the monk aspect. So there is this aspect of working with the deity, the taboo, that Shiva represents the taboo, that Vishnu is that kind of public face of prosperity and wealth, the king frequency. Brahma is somewhat of the monk, the Gandalf, we'll call it, taboo. And Shiva, well, he's somewhat of the... Yeah, he's probably maybe the shadow that hasn't been integrated for some people. Ultimately, he's the same Brahma and Vishnu, but he's the face that is not attached to really. He doesn't need disciples of Brahma, perhaps of the monk would have disciples in a congregation, and there's a Krishna, Hare Krishna group around very close to where I live here in Mooloolaba. The Krishna is probably a really good indicator, a representation of Shiva, and the Krishna is the guide or the manifestation of Vishnu in some of their traditions. I think it's the Mahabharata, and it's not going to come to me, the Gita, the Gita Bhagavad Gita. So basically Krishna does represent that the chariot bearer, the chariot rider, who's integrated the masculine and the feminine. So he has that aspect, but with the Gita, he's also the Godhead. He's the Shiva aspect. He's the unmanifested, who is as a channel of the form of the incarnated, speaking to Arjuna, who's having this war against his relatives, and this battle that it seems like it's wanted to be avoided, but it seems to be it's an act of divinity. It is breaking the taboo, Arjuna going to war against his relatives, his uncles, etc. But he's being moved by the spirit, by the divine, to follow his dharma, his purpose, his passion. And Shiva is somewhat of that representation. For me, talking from that male perspective, this worked a lot with the feminine, with Mary Magdalene and the Morrigan, Bridget, all both from the Celtic perspective and the Christian perspective for Mary Magdalene, but all other aspects of divinity, Queen Isis and the Egyptian aspect, Hathor, Sekhmet, from the Grecian perspective of Venus and Aphrodite and Athena, Hera, all different aspects of the Divine Mother. What Shiva is representing from a masculine is a masculine that works within the feminine, who's empowering the feminine, who's not just a face of the what we call the masculine faces of God, of Vishnu, Brahma, and Shiva. I think what's really important, even with me talking at the moment, Shiva is probably more of the space of not talking. He's the presence. He's a witness to our ability to work with the feminine through detachment, through the withdrawal of attention. So that's all very wordy, what I just said. That's kind of the introduction, the 9-minute introduction. It's quite a hefty one. But I think what I'm getting at, and what I feel I'm getting at, reconciling conscious thinking with intuitive subconscious feeling, is the taboo is this space where it's often what we repressed. We may have repressed, like perhaps a need to get into nature. We repress the power of the unknown, the subconscious, the feminine, the serpent energy in the Garden of Eden. The Vishnu, who wears a serpent around his shoulder, would probably more be closely akin to Eve than he would be Adam. He'd be more alive with the serpent. He would be suggesting that the power of the serpent, and again, Shiva, it's important to understand, Shiva is very much somewhat of an archetype, like a lot of energies of the sacred masculine feminine. Shiva would represent not just the magician frequency. Shiva would represent the master of the animals, of Canutus. He would represent the horn god. He represents the masculine is connected to nature, the Tom Bombadil frequency of Lord of the Rings, the Odin of the Norse tradition, who's somewhat reconciled both their Loki and Thor energies, the father of Thor and Loki. That he's somewhat of an aspect who recognizes the power of nature in moving beyond limiting beliefs, because he's not restrained by societal demands, expectations, which Vishnu works within the world to really empower himself. So the real theme of this episode, even though it's a bit of a off the cuff theme, a bit unusual, and I don't know if I'll even share it, but it might not get done because it does feel a little bit different to the others, is that where there might be blocks coming up on your awakening journey, and I talk about this particularly in Prosperity Embodied, which is broken into 3 books: the initiation of being prosperity conscious, the integration of integrating power prosperity, and finally acting for the spirit of the embodiment of that full authentic version of ourselves, which was really a manifestation of the Ascension Code and working with the Ascended Masters, which Shiva and Vishnu and Brahma are a part of the other deities I mentioned, to really raise our consciousness beyond pure form driven needs to align with what our soul's calling towards. Is it Shiva is this aspect of when we're breaking beyond these temporary beliefs and needing to manifest to prove to other people, needing to manifest to show this, or I need to manifest to get this part and this own desire. Look, the desire exists in our frequency because it's real. It can often be felt. We need the money to have our food or buy our home or support our family and our partner. But going beyond the conscious need is when we get more of the subconscious connection to the earth, to nature, to our own inner desire, or simply alignment with who we already are. It's less of the need to actually manifest. It's more of that embodied acting for the spirit, that the expression of who we are becomes natural. And because we are aligned with who we really are, and who we really are is very fluid, it can change and flow with these archetypes in this nature, but it's less a defined codependent need to be approved by other people in society. It's somewhat accessing what could be repressed or has been repressed but is wanted to be expressed. There isn't really such a great need to force manifestation. And a lot of those blocks representative of the tower in the card of the major arcana dissolve. We have our own somewhat of our societal death. A lot of this I think is coming up. I'm not sure whether to say it, but I watched the movie the other night. It's called The Green Knight, that stars Dev Patel. And it's very much tied in with the Arthurian dynasty and the Arthurian legacy with Morgan, Guinevere, Merlin, Arthur, etc. But what was very symbolic and clear within this narrative of the knight's tale, so to speak, of Gawain, or Gawain, however you pronounce his name, the nephew of Arthur, he's somewhat of the symbolic of this every man, every woman who somewhat come through childhood and is in that warrior frequency, but wanting to carve out their own path. And there's, without spoiling too much of the content of the movie, there's this clear analogy that moving towards societal goals, the societal sake, doesn't really provide fulfilling outcome. It's somewhat of the wheel of time. It's a hamster wheel of codependence to creating an identity that needs to improve in order to feel worthy. When we can feel worthy without needing the identity which will be approved by society. It's turning the wheel around, or the metaphor on its head. For then, when we've worked through conscious manifestation for so long, when we've been successful, we've changed a lot of our reality, and so we've got to a stage where we're perhaps wanting to go a bit deeper. We want to go deep because we feel like there's nothing really missing so much, and we've attracted a lot of what we've asked for. Then we feel it's like we've put the pieces back together, and we're still with the original person we used to be, or still I've always been, but there's just not that same necessity to cling for approval anymore, because we've worked with the taboo. with access to parts of ourselves which we previously hid in fear of rejection, which is really more just societal projections of our own or conditioning that we believe if we shared, we would be rejected. So just limiting belief patterns that we accepted, which weren't, I mean, they were true for us because we believed them. And because we believe them, we got evidence of that in our reality. Because what we believe, we get reflection of. Reality is a reflection of our own perception. So because our perception has changed, we're not looking so much out there. We have had that withdrawal of attention enough to feel more of that sense of who we are within, which is not so affected by external. It's more aligned with the Shiva frequency, who's also Vishnu, who's also Jesus, who's also Cernunnos, and the feminine. It's just an awareness that we're more than the form that we express in the world. But when we're in the world, we can play with it because we recognize we're more than the form. Thanks again for being a part of this relatively unusual episode. Pray and intend it was of value for you. If you're interested in learning more, particularly around not just the initiation, integration, embodiment phase of Prosperity Embodied, I particularly recommend, Meeting Mary Magdalene and the Ascension Code. My first books. Meeting Mary Magdalene is really a book that only published a year or two earlier, but it's built from the first manuscript I and Michael that I wrote 10 years ago. This experience of walking the Camino de Santiago in France, Spain, and Portugal, where a lot of these beliefs, where I was walking through the mountains, somewhat detached from society, is they came up that a lot of what I thought was important wasn't so important. What had been the taboo, I had to encounter and face and accept that part of me, and witness the critical mind, the critical self that was ultimately criticizing my own self. And the Ascension Code, which was the follow-up to it, was really a starting point to not only consciously change my life, which is the subtitle of the sub, but it was more a means of how do I integrate this initiated awakening process where I'm raising my vibration, my world is changing, and I don't necessarily understand what's happening. But ultimately, with working with the ascended masters and all these different frequencies of the masculine and feminine, coming out the other side of the, I guess what we could say, a more, not a better or lesser human, just someone who accepts the parts of me that I rejected. I was afraid of sharing. Bye for now.